The moment my son told me I was living too large, I didn't react the way most people probably would have expected. I didn't defend myself, and I didn't remind him of everything I had done for him over the years. I simply sat there after the call ended, staring at the wall in front of me while his words repeated in my head. It was not the phrase itself that bothered me, it was what it revealed. Somewhere along the way, the role I had spent decades building as a father had quietly transformed into something else entirely, and I had not fully realized it until that moment. My name is Daniel, and I'm 68 years old. Most of my life was spent working long hours, saving carefully, and telling myself that eventually there would come a season where I could finally slow down. I imagined quiet mornings, small trips, and the freedom to make decisions without pressure or obligation attached to them. But when retirement finally arrived, my life did not become simpler. Instead, it gradually became centered around everyone else's needs, while my own plans kept getting postponed further into the background. My son has been married for 7 years now. Their wedding was beautiful, but it was also far more expensive than they could realistically afford on their own. The costs increased slowly, almost carefully, through dozens of small upgrades that sounded reasonable individually: a larger venue, a better photographer, additional guests, decorations that suddenly seemed necessary. By the end of it, I had paid close to $45,000 without ever truly stopping to think about the total. At the time, it felt natural, because I convinced myself that helping them start their life together was simply part of being a father. They have 2 children now, my grandson and granddaughter. My grandson is 10 years old and reminds me of myself in ways that sometimes catch me off guard. He asks questions because he genuinely wants to understand things, not because he is trying to impress anyone. When we talk, he leans forward and listens carefully, as though every answer might lead to another idea worth exploring. My granddaughter is quieter, gentler in her personality, but observant in ways children rarely explain out loud. She studies the emotional temperature of a room before she speaks, especially around her mother. I lived alone, about 30 minutes away from them, in a small, predictable routine that never changed much. Meanwhile, their lifestyle kept expanding. My son worked in corporate sales and earned a strong income, around $95,000 before bonuses. My daughter-in-law worked part-time for a design company and contributed a decent salary as well. They were not struggling financially in the way people often imagine when they hear stories like this. They had enough money to live comfortably if things were managed carefully. That detail matters because what happened later was never about survival. The first major financial request came when they decided to buy a house in a good neighborhood with strong schools. They needed help with the down payment, around $70,000, and I agreed almost immediately. I told myself it was an investment in stability for the children. After that, helping became easier because the boundary had already been crossed once. A car upgrade followed when my son's lease ended, another $25,000 described as temporary assistance. Repayments quietly disappeared after a few months, but neither of us addressed it directly because silence often replaces confrontation inside families. Over time, the requests became smaller but more constant. School programs, sports fees, dance classes, repairs, subscriptions, credit card balances, and household expenses all started flowing through my account in one way or another. Individually, none of them seemed important enough to question. Together, they formed a structure I had never consciously agreed to build. I eventually had automatic payments connected to their mortgage contributions, insurance costs, landscaping services, and other recurring bills that continued month after month without discussion. The dangerous thing about routine is that it can hide reality so effectively you stop examining it altogether. If someone had asked me back then how much financial support I was providing, I would have guessed a number far lower than the truth. I avoided looking too closely because deep down, I understood that clarity might force me to confront something uncomfortable. There is a difference between knowing something exists and allowing yourself to fully understand what it means. I had become more than a father or grandfather inside that family structure. I had become a dependable system, one that operated quietly in the background while everyone else built their lives on top of it. The shift happened slowly enough that I barely noticed it in real time. Expectations rarely announce themselves openly. They settle into daily life through tone, repetition, and assumptions until they begin to feel permanent. Requests stopped sounding like requests and started sounding like continuations of arrangements already understood. By the time I recognized the change clearly, it had been normal for years. I remember sitting at my kitchen table one evening reviewing my accounts when something about the balances felt tighter than usual. It was not alarming yet, but it was enough to make me look more carefully. I started scrolling through transactions one by one, expecting to find only a handful of recurring expenses. Instead, I found a long chain of financial commitments that had simply continued because I never interrupted them. So I took out a notepad and began writing everything down with the same methodical attention I once used during my career. Every transfer, every subscription, every insurance payment, and every recurring contribution went onto that page. It took far longer than I expected because the list kept growing. When I finally totaled everything, the amount stopped me cold. It was paying over $4,000 every single month into their household. The number itself was not impossible for me to manage, but seeing it written clearly in one place changed something inside me. Numbers remove emotion from situations people spend years justifying emotionally. A single expense can always be explained away, but an organized pattern tells a different story. I realized I was no longer helping occasionally or temporarily. I was consistently financing a life that belonged to someone else. That realization did not make me angry. What I felt instead was clarity, heavy and unavoidable. Even then, I did not take immediate action because I needed time to think honestly about what the situation meant. A few days later, my son called me on a Tuesday evening, just as I finished dinner. The moment I saw his name on my phone, I felt a quiet instinct warning me the conversation would matter. His voice sounded calm and prepared, the tone people use when they have rehearsed their points in advance. He explained that he and his wife had concerns about me. He mentioned a recent purchase and a small trip I had taken, both completely ordinary decisions. Yet he described them as though they reflected irresponsible behavior. Then he carefully said the sentence that stayed with me afterward. "Dad, maybe you shouldn't be living quite so large right now." He continued talking about responsibility, planning ahead, and thinking long term. All lessons I had spent my entire adult life practicing. I listened without interrupting because while he spoke, all I could think about was the list sitting on my kitchen table from a few days earlier. When he finally finished, I simply thanked him for sharing his thoughts and told him I would think about it. Then I ended the call. I did not argue because something inside me had already shifted before the conversation even started. Afterward, I remained in the same chair holding the phone and asked myself a question I should have considered years earlier. At what point does support stop being support and become dependency disguised as family responsibility? I did not answer that question that night, but I also could not ignore it anymore. The next morning I woke up focused rather than emotional. There is a major difference between those two states because anger rushes while focus moves carefully. I made coffee, returned to the kitchen table, and began reviewing everything again from the beginning. This time I included every major contribution from the past several years: the wedding, the house down payment, the car, the forgotten transfers, the unpaid loans, and every gift that had quietly become expected support, all went onto the page. It took most of the day to complete. When I finished adding everything together, the total came to just over $340,000. I checked the math 3 separate times because part of me wanted the number to be wrong. It was not wrong. That amount of money had gradually moved out of my savings and retirement plans into their lifestyle over the years. I sat quietly staring at the final total while thinking about all the things I once planned for myself: travel, a smaller house somewhere peaceful, and the freedom I believed retirement would eventually bring had all been replaced by obligations I never formally agreed to carry forever. What struck me most was realizing none of it had been forced on me directly. Every payment, every agreement, and every automatic transfer had happened because I allowed it to happen. That realization mattered because if I had built the structure myself, then I was also responsible for changing it. At that point, the situation stopped being about my son or his wife. It became about me finally deciding what kind of life I wanted to continue living. I did not need permission or approval to make that decision. Later that day, I called my bank and started disconnecting everything tied to their household. Automatic mortgage contributions, insurance payments, subscriptions, maintenance services, and recurring transfers were all reviewed individually. Some ended immediately, while others were scheduled to stop within 30 days. I did not do it to punish them or create panic. I did it because I needed distance between my finances and their lifestyle. Once the process was complete, I felt something unexpected. Not relief exactly, but space, as though part of my life finally belonged to me again. My next call was to my lawyer. I scheduled an appointment because I understood that if I was going to change one part of my life, honestly, I needed to examine the rest of it with the same honesty. A few quiet days passed afterward before my grandson called me needing help with a school assignment about structural forces and weight distribution. We spent nearly an hour talking about how bridges hold pressure and why certain shapes remain stable under stress. At the end of the conversation, he told me he wanted to build things one day. I told him I believed he could, and I meant every word. That conversation mattered more to me than all the financial discussions combined. It reminded me that not everything in my life required fixing or confrontation. Some things simply needed protection and guidance. Later that evening, I decided I would still create something meaningful for my grandchildren's future, but it would be done differently. I was no longer willing to finance an unsustainable system inside their household, yet I also refused to ignore what genuinely mattered long term. Structure became the key difference. You do not hope a structure holds together. You design it carefully so that it does. 30 days later, the payment stopped. My son called first, confused about why certain automatic expenses had not gone through. I calmly explained that I had reviewed my finances and decided the support would not continue. His confusion quickly turned into frustration. He explained that they relied on that money and that I should have warned him sooner. I listened carefully before telling him something simple but important. He had a stable career, a strong income, and a family depending on him, which meant he was fully capable of handling his own responsibilities. The conversation ended badly emotionally, but clearly practically. Later that day, my daughter-in-law called, louder and far less controlled. She accused me of being unfair and creating unnecessary stress for the family. I listened without arguing before finally telling her this was not a shared decision because the responsibility had never truly been shared either. Silence followed, and eventually the call ended. Over the next several days, messages continued arriving from both of them, trying to explain the situation differently, but changing the wording could not change the reality underneath it. A week later, my grandson called again about a school project he had built. He proudly explained every detail while I listened and encouraged him to continue. That conversation reminded me once again why I made the decisions I did. The goal was never to create emotional distance from my family. The goal was to rebuild healthier boundaries where relationships were not tied so tightly to financial dependence. Not long after that, my son visited me alone. He looked tired in the way people do after being forced to confront realities they previously avoided. He asked why I had never fully explained how much money I was contributing over the years. I told him I had explained it before, more than once, but he simply had not treated it seriously because it had become normal. To his credit, he did not argue with that point. He admitted he never realized how large the total had become because when support continues long enough, people stop measuring it. For the first time in years, our conversation felt balanced, not comfortable, not fully repaired, but honest in a way it had not been before. Things did not magically reset after that meeting. Adjustments take time when an imbalance has existed for years. There were still difficult conversations and uncomfortable moments, but the structure underneath everything had changed permanently. And once a structure changes, the lives built on top of it must eventually adjust as well. A few days later, I revisited the plans I used to keep postponing for myself. For the first time in years, they no longer felt distant or unrealistic. They felt possible again because my life was no longer being quietly redirected into someone else's. There is one quiet moment I still think about often. I was sitting alone at my kitchen table after everything had finally settled, surrounded by silence that no longer carried obligation with it. My relationship with my son is different now, more fragile in some ways, but also more honest than it used to be. There is a small house I have been considering not far from where Carol and I once dreamed of living. It is simple, modest, and enough. And maybe understanding what enough truly means was the lesson I should have learned years ago. My grandson still calls me to talk about bridges and ideas that have nothing to do with money, and every time he does, I realize something important. In the end, I was never really trying to build dependency. I was trying to build something strong enough to last.